All right.
Um,
Oh, I have to click OK here for a second, and then we'll.
Got
All
it.
right. It's my honor to moderate here today to be with my friends Mehmet and Enis again. I'm especially honored that Nicholas Wolterstorff, the former Noah Porter Professor of Philosophy of Religion at Yale University, is our guest here today. Um, Nick's had probably as big an influence on my own philosophical work, although he wasn't my teacher directly in any classes. But I remember as a student reading a book he wrote that was a turn on Kant's reason within the bounds, religion within the bounds of reason. Nick wrote reason within the bound. Kant did religion within the bounds of reason. Nick wrote reason within the bounds of religion, and that book was very uh, suggestive and gave me a new way of thinking about things. And then the next book was one that he participated in, and I'd say it's as revolutionary a book in philosophy of religion as has been written in the past 50 years, and that was the Faith and Rationality volume that Nick and Alvin Plantinga co-edited, but also wrote essays for. And I think it turned religious epistemology upside down. People had new ways of thinking about things. Um, and it was just enormously influential for me. And a lot of my work since that time has reflected Nick's locating, I got to confirm my language here, Nick's location of um, the kind of general epistemological orientation that I've taken in the work of Thomas Reid. So I'm a sort of Reid Wolterstorffian when it comes to philosophy of religion, but that's a mouthful. I'll just leave it there. I've also been hugely influenced by Nick in my concerns for peace in Israel and Palestine and my siding mostly with Palestinians, but also uh, in my recent work on love has been influenced by Nick. So I've been influenced by Nick on justice and love, which is the title of his talk today, and I'll turn it over to him.
Okay, thank you very much, Kelly, for that introduction, and thank you all for this invitation to speak to you. Um, I began my philosophical career around 1960. I began my philosophical career focusing especially on metaphysics and to some extent on theory of knowledge, epistemology. Um, Then after about 15 years of that, I began thinking and speaking about justice. And the topic of justice has ever since remained prominent in my thinking and writing. So here's the issue that I would like to begin with. What led me to move from my first love, metaphysics, to this extensive thinking and writing about justice? Um, well, in the past 50 years, there's been a great deal of discussion in the analytic tradition of philosophy about justice. And I would say that almost all of that has been stimulated by the publication in the 60s by John Rawls, professor at Harvard, of a book that he called Theory of Justice. Um, and what happened is that there were then commentators on Rawls and commentators on commentators on Rawls and so forth. So that philosophers were talking to each other, and the background for it all was John Rawls. Um, a peculiarity of Rawls's book, which he makes clear, is that he says he's talking about justice in an ideal society, not in our actual non-ideal societies. And he said his reason for that is that he thought you first had to get clear about justice in an ideal society before you could talk about justice in our actual non-ideal societies. The irony is, however, that he never got around to talk about justice in our actual non-ideal societies. So in my early days as a philosopher, I knew about these Rawlsian discussions, and I read some of them. It was philosophers talking to and about philosophers and so forth. So I read some of this discussion, and I frankly found it boring, just boring. Philosophers talking just to philosophers. And I myself had no interest in thinking about justice in an ideal society. So it was not that philosophical discussion of justice in the analytic tradition that led me to start thinking and writing about justice. Here's how it happened. In September 1975, I was teaching at my college, Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I received an invitation to speak at a conference in Potchefstroom, South Africa. Potchefstroom is a middle-sized city in the center of South Africa. The conference was a conference on higher education in the tradition of Reformed Protestantism. So my college sent me there, and I attended. As I say, this was in the day of when apartheid, South African apartheid, was still in full force. The conference was not about apartheid. It was about, as I said, higher education in the tradition of Reformed Protestantism. There were, of course, white South African scholars there, and there were so-called colored scholars from South Africa in attendance, and quite a few of us foreigners, especially a large contingent of Dutch scholars. Now, Afrikaans, the language of Afrikaans, is a derivative of Dutch, and the Afrikaners are descendants of a Dutch colonizing many centuries ago. So the Dutch and the Afrikaners could understand each other very well. The Dutch were very well informed about apartheid, and they were very angry about it. So in the question period after lectures, the Dutch, which was not about apartheid, the Dutch person would get up and say, "Professor, I very much appreciated what you said, but I'd like to ask you a question about apartheid." This happened over and over, and in our coffee sessions and meals together, apartheid was the main topic of discussion. So the Afrikaners were getting very, very anxious that their conference was being what word do I want to use, was being taken away, was being hijacked by these discussions about apartheid, and especially by the Dutch. So finally, they agreed to hold a late night session, which was entirely devoted to apartheid. I think it was at 10 o'clock at night. It was the most intense discussion I've ever participated in all my years. The Dutch, as I say, were very angry about apartheid. So what happened first at the conference is that blacks and coloreds from South Africa stood up and began to talk about the daily indignities that they experienced under the system of apartheid. And they issued a call for justice. The Afrikaners, to my surprise, responded like this. They said, "Justice is not the issue. It's not the issue. We Afrikaners are a very benevolent people. We would like all these 10 or 11 different nationalities in South Africa to develop separately. And for that, they have to be pulled apart. And each one develops its own basket weaving style and its own poetry and its own fiction and so forth. So we're a benevolent people." And I shall never forget, one of the women from South Africa got up and with tears in her eyes said, "Why can't we just love each other? Why do you people always criticize us and never thank us for this wonderful system of apartheid?" I shall never forget. I felt that I'd been given a call I interpreted it as a call from God to speak up for these suffering people. Not to become an activist, to remain a professor, but in my job as professor, to begin to speak about justice. So that's how it began. I left feeling compelled to think and speak about justice. That was September 1975. Then in May 1978, I received an invitation to attend a conference on Palestinian human rights on the west side of Chicago. Grand Rapids is 150 miles from Chicago. So I don't know why I received the invitation, and I don't know what it was in me that led me to accept it, but I did. There were about 150 Palestinians there, and they poured out their emotions in intense language and described the daily humiliations that they experienced. And once again, they issued a call for justice. So it was those two episodes, the first and then the second, that propelled me to think and speak about justice. So what is so now let me move on to talk about how I think about justice. There are two formulas for justice that come down to us from antiquity. One from Aristotle and one from a 3rd century Roman jurist named Ulpian, U-L-P-I-A-N, Ulpian. Aristotle said that justice consists in the equitable distribution of goods. Ulpian said that justice consists in rendering to everybody their right or due. His Latin word was jus, J-U-S, and that doesn't have a direct translation into English, but it's usually translated, justice consists of rendering to everybody their right or due. When I first began thinking about justice, I interpreted these as two competing formulas for the nature of justice. But in recent years, I've come to think that that's probably not right. I think that Ulpian's formula really is trying to tell us what justice is. But I think Aristotle's formula is not trying to do that, but rather to give us a general description of what justice looks like. And I've discovered recently that that's also how Aquinas interprets these two. Aquinas interprets Ulpian as telling us the nature of justice, and Aristotle is giving a description of the general contours of justice. So Ulpian's definition became enormously influential in the West. It opened the Byzantine Emperor Justinian's codification of Roman law. It's there in the first paragraph. And from there on, it influences the West. And I've come to think that that's the right way to think of it. To act justly is to treat your fellow human beings in accord with their right, in accord with what to do with them. Okay. So that means we have to, justice is grounded in rights. I think that's correct. So let's talk a little bit about rights. How am I doing on time, Kelly? Okay. You can all still hear me?
Yes,
You
we
can
can.
all hear me?
Yes,
Yeah?
we can.
Yeah. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about rights. In recent years, there's been great. So everybody agrees that there are what are commonly called in English positive rights. That is, rights conferred on us by the government, by our university, by our bank, or whatever. But there's been a lot of dispute about natural rights. so-called natural rights, rights that we have in the nature of things. And there's been a lot of resistance to the idea of natural rights, especially among Christians. There have been two arguments. One argument is this: the idea of natural rights was invented by the late medieval philosopher William of Ockham, and that is part of Ockham's philosophical individualism. Others have argued that, well, don't know about Occam, but that it was invented by the secular philosophers of the European Enlightenment, and that it's part and parcel of their philosophical individualism. Either way, the idea is that the idea of natural rights just carries in its DNA the idea of individualism, and for the more selfish individualism, that the point of the language of rights is to claim, is for each of us to claim our rights. I would say that that view, that objection to the idea of natural rights, has been decisively refuted in recent years. The writers who claim that Occam or the Enlightenment philosophers invented the idea of natural rights were philosophers. What's happened in recent years is that legal historians have begun writing about rights. And what they've argued persuasively is that already 3 centuries before Occam, the medieval jurists were using the idea of natural rights. And more recently, legal historians have argued that the ancient Roman lawyers were using the idea of natural rights. So the idea of natural rights was invented by Occam or the Enlightenment is just decisively wrong. And as to the claim that it's basically just for each of us proclaiming our rights, when you come into my presence, I have rights with respect to you, yes, but you also have rights with respect to me. So there's nothing selfishly individualistic about rights. Rights are symmetrical in that regard. And furthermore, let's notice that institutions have rights. Our banks have rights, universities have rights, and so forth. So I think it's just plain false to say that the idea of natural rights somehow is intrinsically, selfishly individualistic. Okay, so now a word about how I understand rights. As you might guess, there's a lot of controversy among philosophers about how to understand rights. So I'll just give you my own view. 2 things. First, let's note that every human being has worth, some sort of goodness. The Jewish tradition, the Christian, the Islamic tradition all hold that every human being has the intrinsic worth of being created in the image of God. But we also have other kinds of worth, moral worth, when someone acts courageously. Intellectual worth, when a student writes an excellent paper in my philosophy class. And athletic worth, when somebody wins the 100-meter dash in the Olympics and so forth. So everybody has worth. That's the first point. Now the second point. Notice that we can treat our fellow human beings in ways that pay due respect for their worth, or in ways that don't pay due respect to them for their worth. Let me say it again. We can treat our fellow human beings in ways that show due respect for their worth, or in ways that do not show due respect for their worth. In the American system, university system of grading, if a student writes a superb paper in my philosophy class, they've acquired the worth of writing a superb paper. And in the American system, they deserve an A. They have a right to an A, treat them as their worth requires, I have to give them an A. And if I don't, I have wronged them. So two ideas. We all have worth of various kinds, and there are ways of treating people in accord with their worth or not in accord with their worth. Put them together. I think rights are this. You have a right to my treating you a certain way. If treating you that way is required by showing due respect for your worth. Let me say it again. You have a right to my treating you a certain way. If treating you that way is required for showing you due respect for your worth. Rights are grounded in worth. And incidentally, all the UN documents about human rights, 4 or 5 of them, are all also dignity-based documents. They all argue that rights are grounded in the various forms of dignity that we human beings possess. So let me close with a word about my understanding of the relation between love and justice. In the 1930s, a Swedish bishop, Lutheran bishop, Anders Nygren, wrote a number of books, especially a famous book, Agape and Eros, in which he argued this. He argued that the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, justice is important. But in the Christian New Testament, love is important. Love supersedes justice, he said. Justice is old-fashioned Hebrew stuff. Love is New Testament Christian stuff. Love supersedes justice. That became enormously, Nygren's view became enormously influential. And so theologians began pitting love and justice against each other. Their thought was this: love pays no attention to what justice requires. If you're paying attention to what justice requires, you're not loving the person. If you love the person, you will pay no attention to what justice requires. So is that correct? I don't think so. Nygren was, of course, quoting Jesus when Jesus said that the fundamental imperative of the Hebrew Bible was love your neighbor as yourself and God above all. Love your neighbor as yourself. The Greek word used there is agape. And what Nygren said is agape means seeking the good of your neighbor with no attention whatsoever to what justice requires. But Jesus was quoting a passage from the Hebrew Bible. He wasn't just inventing something. And if you look at the passage that he quoted, you see that examples of love in the passage include examples of justice. So here's the clear implication. Love incorporates justice. Put it like this: agapic love will sometimes go beyond justice, yeah, but it never goes against justice. It never ignores justice. It never wrongs people. It never treats people in violation of how they have a right to be treated. So my view is that rather than seeing these two as pitted against each other, as I say, we should see love as incorporating justice. Let me call it off there and see what questions you people have. Kelly, I can't hear you. I
Yeah.
still can.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick.
Oh, no, I can now.
Yeah, I turned my sound off. I
Okay.
have some people working in my house and they were making noise when you were talking, so
I see.
I turned it off. Uh, while Ennis gathers his thoughts, he's going to respond. I want to say um, just one thing about love and justice empirically. Uh, Nick read and has commented on my book, Raging Fire of Love, What I've Learned from Jesus, the Jews, and the Prophet. And one thing I learned, and I've learned this in my studies in cognitive science, is that if people don't have some empathy for other people, they aren't just to them. Um, they, by and large, they aren't just. Like if we don't have some empathy for people starving in Africa, we won't do anything. If we don't
Right.
have some empathy for uh, the suffering of Palestinians, we just won't do anything. Love needs to move people to do things, and we tend not to be moved simply by demands of justice. And so there's a lot of empirical psychology about um, the need for love for us to be just. Anyway,
I think
I'll leave it at that and turn it
and
over
then
to
the and
you
then
want to.
the obvious next question is how does empathy get evoked?
Yeah,
Um, my own interpretation is this: I reflected on the South African experience. So what evoked empathy in me? If I understand myself, what evoked empathy in me was seeing their faces and hearing their
yeah,
voices.
yeah,
I had read in news articles about South Africa, about apartheid. That didn't evoke empathy in me. It was actually seeing their faces and hearing their voices. So I think
yeah,
crucial is this personal encounter. I mean, it can be on film or television, but seeing their seeing your faces and hearing your voices.
yeah. No, there's nothing like, and seeing people face to face. There is nothing like um, um, seeing someone and hear and listening to them
Yeah.
to create empathy. There's just no, I think there's no substitute. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Enis um, and see what he has to say. Enis?
So thank you very much, Nick. So first, I may have misunderstood some of your views. If that's the case, you can correct me. So I will just try to put a little bit Islamic perspective on what you said. But of course, it's not my real area of specialization. So first of all, I think your work is very valuable for Muslim thinkers because we, like Christians, believe that justice is something intrinsic and God-given, and it's not just a social construct or utilitarian calculations. So your work should be, I think, studied by Muslims who are interested in justice and rights and love issues. We also believe that justice is divinely grounded in divine nature or commands depending on which view you take in Islamic tradition. And also, I think clearly in the Quran, Islamic holy book, there is uh, an idea of theistic basic human rights. Like, for example, Quran states that Allah honored the children of Adam, and it is usually taken to imply that humans have inherited dignity. So that's my initial comment. I wonder, and I'm not. We didn't.
Let me just say something.
Yes,
I didn't
yes.
say, I said almost nothing about justice and Christian Hebrew scripture, but yeah, deep in the Hebrew Bible is this: I, the Lord, am just, so you be just, and to imitate the divine. That's deep in Christian scripture. And another point that I didn't bring up is people sometimes will quite often ask me, isn't there a just so I this Ulpian definition of justice? People will sometimes ask me, but isn't there a distinctly biblical understanding of justice? And I say, I think the biblical understanding is treat human beings in accord with their worth. But what we do find in Christian and Hebrew scripture is what I sometimes call a distinct contour of justice. Give priority to the widows, the aliens, the impoverished. That Plato wrote a whole book about justice, the Republic, but he never talks about the widows, the orphans, the aliens, and the impoverished. So that's just a parenthesis. Continue.
Thank you very much. And this, I would like to ask you some ideas. So initially, when I read some of your work about this and when I heard your speech, it seems your idea of justice is something like more like a legal kind of idea, justice defined in legal terms about protecting, let's say, human rights. Again, I wonder whether this can be taken, whether we can make this justice more broader. Usually in Islamic tradition, especially in Sufis and Islamic philosophers, and probably I guess that's the case in Christian mystics, justice is not just legalistic justice. It also has like maintaining cosmic balance, and people usually talk about spiritual justice. So one may criticize, maybe if I get again correctly, your view is a little bit too much legalistic, too much about legal discussions, which is okay. But I wonder whether it can be extended to involve more, let's say,
Oh, absolutely. So whatever I said, I don't mean to give that impression because um, I think of justice as pertaining to everyday life. Professors can treat students unjustly, and students can treat professors unjustly. Um, I've been involved in a sort of prison ministry here in Michigan, and it became clear to me that wardens treat prisoners unjustly all the time. So it's not just legal, us and the state and so forth, but it's the fine texture of our human existence. Students and professors, wardens and prisoners, businessmen and clients, and so forth. Yep.
think which you mentioned also, some Muslims may wonder whether we can use your ideas because you have a Christian foundation of rights of being created in image of God, and Muslims usually don't hold this view.
I
However,
see.
we have two similar ideas. So first, Quran says that humans are Khalif, or let's they are like inheritors of the earth. God has given earth to humans. So this idea may be taken similar to the image
Yeah.
of God.
Um,
Or Sufis, they see humans as the entities which can reflect the God's attributes or names better than anything which is created. So humans have the ability to reflect God's properties in a Neoplatonic sense. So I think this can be used to change your
because
idea of image of God to make it more like Islamic if one
Yeah,
Muslim wants to
wonderful.
defend to
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, that from your brief description, it sounds as can be used to the same purpose. Yep. Yep.
Uh, what else we can say? So
And it's
as
just a
I
quick, can I ask a
yes,
quick question?
yes,
So I take it that Nick's point is at least how Christians understand kind of intrinsic human worth is because they're created in the image of God. And you're saying you can do the same with the Muslim doctrines you were,
yes.
yeah, okay.
So, like God being humans being the inheritors or halifs of the earth could be a similar idea, or like humans being the best reflectors of God's attributes. So, Sufis believe that everything on earth partly reflects some attribute of God or name of the God. They are like mirrors, but humans are the best mirrors because we have free will, and being the best mirror gives. It's like an image of God, you may say. It's a very similar idea because you
Yeah, it sounds
reflect
pretty
God's
close.
names.
Yeah.
Yes. So
That's
that's
wonderful. I would love to read about that. Kelly, find out where I can read
All
about
right. Sounds good.
it's especially Rumi and Ibn Arabi's understanding of for them actually even every justice which we see on earth is a reflection of human God's justice. So being actually perfectly just means to clear your ego so that you can reflect better the God's justice on earth. So that's one way we can interpret the image of God.
it.
So that's all I can say. Uh, Thank you very much. It was a nice talk, and as I say, it's an important topic. I think we Muslims should read your work and uh, use it and inspire by it. Make Muslim versions of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Um, Nick, we have some questions, and I'm going to ask, and they're in the chat already, and I'll ask people to ask them if they don't mind. But if they don't want, I'll just read what they wrote.
Yeah.
So, Shahan Hatip, are you still there? Would you like to ask your question? Is Shahan still there? Here?
Do you
No?
have his question, Kelly?
I have the question. So, all right. It says, it seems like Professor Nick doesn't make a clear difference between pity and love. What's the relationship between them? Which one is inferior to the other?
Pity and love. Wow. So the English word, let me start here, the way a philosopher starts, I suppose. The English word love refers to a number of quite different phenomena. Um, One kind of love is the love that consists of being attracted to something on account of its worth. Um, when I visit, like the love of Hagia Sophia, when I visited Istanbul and stood there in the middle of, under the dome of Hagia Sophia, this was love, grabbed by the majesty, by the worth or excellence. That's one kind of love. Another kind of love is what in English we call attachment. Attachment is kind of mysterious, but it's being invested in something. A little kitten shows up on my doorstep on a winter morning. It's not a very, it's not, there are better kittens around, but I take it in and I become, well, devoted to it, attached to it. So there's love as attachment. There's the love of some activity, loving gardening, loving talking with friends, and so forth. Um, so the kind of love that Jesus was talking about, that Christian Hebrew scripture talks about, is love which seeks the good of the other person, or indeed of oneself. Agapic love. Oh dear, now I forgot the question.
What
Kelly?
the difference between love and pity?
Oh yeah. Pity, I haven't thought about that, but I would say that pity is one form of love. One form probably of agapic love. It's a certain form of seeking the good of the other person, taking, it's not just, if the pity goes beyond just feeling pitiful, but actually seeks the good of the other, then it's a form of love. Of course, I'm just thinking on my, I was going to say on my feet, on my chair here. Pity may stop with feeling sorry for the other person and do nothing to help the other person. Sometimes pity is just too bad, I pity you, but see you tomorrow. Um, I'd have to think about that, but a good question.
So one thing, Nick, you said you talked about justice in the real world, and in the real world, when we really should highly value somebody else and seek their good, in fact, what we do is pity people who are
Yeah,
the poor, the widow, and the oppressed. And it's not a
yeah.
virtue. We're looking down on them when it's just
There's
pity.
there's a
But
note of
in the real
there's a note
world,
of there's a
that's
note
the
of
way we are.
there's a note of taking pity on,
Yeah,
of being superior to them. Yeah.
yeah. And it's probably very hard to love uh, in the mode that fully appreciates another's worth as equal to
Without
you.
feeling superior to them.
Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
pity, it seems to me, is pretty common for us
Yes.
and often provides a way out, as you note, of love. but it's not what you're really talking about. Um, Mehmet wrote a question. How does a commitment to justice not become an excuse for revenge? And how does love not become a surrender to injustice?
So let me start with the second. How does love not become a surrender to injustice? Um, well, that's an important part of my disagreement with the Anders Niegun tradition. Love incorporates justice. As I said, it quite often goes beyond justice. But if you're not treating the other person justly, you're not treating them lovingly. Um, that's my answer to the second question. What was the first one, Kelly?
Yeah, let me read it. And so Mehmet sent these questions before you gave your talk. And if
You see.
I think the questions both got answered in your talk, but he says, how does a commitment to justice not become an excuse for revenge?
Yeah, revenge is seeking the evil of the other person. And love is seeking love. Agapic love is seeking the good of the other person. So they're incompatible. How
Yeah.
does it? Oh, but here's something to add. Maybe something I should have said in my talk. There are two basic forms of justice. Let me call them first order and second order. Second order justice consists of dealing with breakdowns. Primary justice is justice in our ordinary relationships with each other, with our institutions, teachers with students, and me with the government, and so forth. Secondary justice deals with breakdowns in primary justice. So it consists of punishment, incarceration, chastising, and so forth. And uh, revenge is revenge is dealing with what you perceive to be a hurt, but it's not seeking the good of the other person. I didn't. I was actually talking about first order justice in my talk, and not second order, which is somewhat more complicated. But even second order justice ultimately seeks the good of the other person, and revenge is the opposite, seeks the harm of the other person. So it's the opposite of love, incompatible.
Yeah. I think partly, I don't know, I don't want to put words
Oh, but
in.
let me just say,
Yeah, go
what I
ahead.
call second order justice can often break down into revenge. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
When I've gone to prison to teach a course there and talk to the prisoners, it's clear to me that a lot of what goes on in prisons is vengeance. You guys deserve to be punished, and you're going to be punished. It's at least this is the American system. I don't know about the Turkish, but I'd be surprised if Turkish prisons are fundamentally different in that regard. It's there's a lot of revenge in prisons.
Hey, Sib Gatula, if I'm saying this name right, are you still there? And your question is in the same area as the one that Nick's talking about now. Would you like to read your question yourself and say anything more to it? Sib is I don't
So
want to
what
keep
are you?
I don't want to keep saying the name wrong. He says, how can the defense of justice not only transcend vengeance, but also establish itself as the highest moral value among human virtues? And uh, I think I'll just stop there. It's pretty close to I think that's close to the question you just answered. So I think we'll pass on.
Okay.
We might contextualize this, Nick, and I don't know if I don't want to put words in Mehmet's mouth or Sibgatula's, um, but Hamas, for example, is certainly responding to injustice in Gaza when they attack Israel, but it clearly was vengeance. And revenge, it wasn't justice because they weren't seeking the good of the other. They were seeking the good of their, in some, I think, misguided way, the good of people that they worked with. And so uh, I think that a sense of justice can move into revenge, but it's not like a consequence of yours. This is a psychological consequence, not kind of a logical consequence. And your view of justice would prevent this if people like were perfectly just actors. They wouldn't seek revenge.
Right.
On your view, but I think I suspect that some of the contextualization that people in the Middle East, Arabs, Muslims, have been on the receiving end of
Yeah.
injustices, and it's natural, I think, for people to respond with vengeance and revenge. But you're not commending it. Barrett, I just got a comment on here. Revenge could be explained as a failure of justice. It's a failure on both sides. A failure on the people often who have done an injustice, and then people want to seek revenge. But it's also a failure of justice on the part of the people who are the victims but want to seek revenge. So it can be a double failure on your view. Definitely a failure of love, as he says.
Yeah.
So let's take Barrett's question. Barrett, I know you can ask your question, and I know you speak good English because he's a native English speaker. So if you don't mind, Barrett, would you
Well,
ask what you'd like?
the question, you mean the question about rendering according to their
Yeah,
due?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Nick, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for
Welcome.
letting me be here. It's a privilege. But yeah, I'm struggling with the idea of worth. Okay, everybody has worth. And to render everybody according to their due or their rights strikes me as I'll read what I wrote as potentially vulnerable to believing that X people are intrinsically worth more than non-X people. And this seems different from the intrinsic worth. And potentially, setting up different categories of human beings as having different worth. And on a simple way, and say, well, should we treat all students the same, whether they write a good essay or a poor essay? They should all get A's. Maybe some argue that, but there seems to be something more significant going on. And my thing is just asking me, I'm speaking English, yes, say.
Yeah, I got to ask the same thing. It's an interrupter when you're thinking.
Yeah, it's just my brain just sort of went,
Exactly.
what?
Yep.
Um, yeah, I'm just wondering how we deal with the idea of intrinsic human worth that's universal, that every human being, when you talk about treating with dignity, okay, so we would say that the student who writes a poor paper and the student who writes a good paper are treated differently relative to the paper, relative to their grade, but they are both treated respecting their intrinsic dignity. And so, yeah, I'm just struggling with this notion of worth as being the category of justice.
Yeah, good point. So I think of it like this. There is intrinsic worth, and in the Christian Jewish tradition, that's especially being created in the image of God, and that's sort of a counterpart in the Islamic tradition. But then there are also all kinds of human beings have worth that's not intrinsic, that they acquire in some way or another. And that will often be so intrinsic worth. I think an implication of that is that the intrinsic worth of human beings, an implication of that is that there are some things that ought never to be done to a human being, that every human being has a right not to be treated like that. No matter what the crime this person may have committed, there are certain things that one ought never to do to him or her. That would be to not to treat them in accord with their intrinsic interests. You should never torture them and so forth. But then there are the non-intrinsic worth. And there, yeah, some students write better papers than others, and some athletes run faster than others. And so we are the respect we accord them is differential. I I mean, I honor all of them, but I give an A to only these students and a middle grade, a C to these others, and because they have, in this case, they have less intellectual worth, as exhibited in the paper that they turned up. So moral worth, some people are more courageous than others, and so forth. Does that begin to speak to? So there's intrinsic worth and then the variable acquired worth.
Right, right. And by the way, I noticed that Saida has had her hand up for a long time, just to note that. But I'll just stop. I've been reflecting on the work of Tom Holland in his book Dominion, and he was wrestling with where did we get the idea, in the West at least, of intrinsic worth, of human rights by virtue of being human.
Yep.
And because he would argue that it wasn't present in classic times, in classical Greek or classic Roman. The idea.
I think he's right about that.
Yeah, and I've heard comments here. I think when I think of the Islamic tradition, it's, Enis, I think, talked about being created in the image of God, or, being created by God. And so as God's creatures, human beings have a unique value, unique worth that is there no matter what. It's absolutely. So that speaks to, why you don't torture, for example, respecting those intrinsic rights. But it seems to me that those intrinsic rights were a problem in South Africa. What you were experiencing there is anyway. Sorry, I start talking, I'll just stop. That was my question, and I'm working on the holding these two things: the intrinsic human rights, okay, and the rights that we gain because of other attributes, other qualities.
I think you're right, and I think your deep analysis of what was going on in South Africa is right. This wonderful good, and then the Afrikaners would say, yes, this is achieved at the cost of some suffering for the time being, but it wasn't just some suffering. They were shuffling the blacks and the coloreds around. They were treating them with deep indignity, and of course. This wonderfully benevolent proposal. They never asked the blacks and the coloreds whether they liked apartheid and whether they found it a good thing. It was they, the Afrikaners. So they were ignoring the deep intrinsic worth of the blacks and the coloreds by shuffling them around and moving them from Cape Town out into the country and so forth. Yeah.
Right.
All right, we're going to move on from that to Saida, who has had her hand up. And Saida's going to ask her question herself.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for your interesting lecture. Well, I first you mentioned your background, because our backgrounds affect our worldviews. I'm an Iranian living in Germany, based in Germany during the event like the conflict in the Middle East. So seeing with my own eyes that all these nice ideals of human dignity, value, virtue, I don't know, love, justice fail. And now my question is, like you talked about love and justice. First of all, they are very vague concepts, and we clearly saw that these concepts, which are the basis for today's human rights, when used by the founding fathers of Western democracy and human rights, Kant, Hegel, Hume, while they were talking about human dignity, they meant by that white people. So it was like already there. Sure, they mentioned all humans have dignity, but some are more human than others. So already they made the classification. Up to today, where we all shocked, where Habermas, the philosopher of the other, who prioritizes that the other and prioritizes justice, blah, 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 said that Palestinians are not the other that demands the same level of moral concerns. So, I mean, on theory, on the level of theory, all these things are nice, love, justice, the other. But when it comes to practice, it seems like some humans are more human than the others. So I mean, all these things, nice things like justice, love, etc., play no role. So first this, and second is like you said, if you're not treating someone justly, you are not treating them lovingly, and for you, love and justice go hand in hand. So classical question is, if God in the day, like in the afterlife, does not punish Hitler, would it be just in concern, like in regard to the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust? So would it be justice? God still loves them. Like God loves all humans. God loves Hitler too. So God is not going to punish Hitler. So I still do not understand how can the concept of love and justice go together in this case, for example. And the third thing is like,
Okay, let's stop with two right now.
okay.
All right, because they're two big ones, and um, we want to make sure there's time to answer them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The founding fathers of the U.S., Jefferson and the others, Madison, who wrote the Constitution, talked in the general terms about all human beings. But in fact, what they meant was white property. When it got down to practice, what they meant was white male property holders. And it took a century to give rights to the blacks, and then 2 centuries to give equal rights to women, and children are still so. So there was this deep discrepancy between the high-flown language and the actuality. Jefferson talks about everybody should be free, but he had himself, what, 150 slaves or something like that. Now your second question was, oh, I find it ever more mysterious how God will treat us in the afterlife, how Hitler will be treated, uh, Stalin. So I don't know. All I know is that in this life, there's both, as I said, first order and second order justice. And the second order justice requires that Hitler, if he had remained alive, be punished in some way or other, be punished in a way that does not violate his intrinsic dignity.
So
That's
executed. So if he's executed, if we are having justice reign, then we are not treating him with his dignity is not preserved if we execute him, or I don't know, imprison him for life. So it's just, how can we preserve his dignity as a human being and have justice reign? So that's the question.
for me, it's a question too. Yeah, that's right. Right.
And one tiny question of the
Can I
last.
say something about your first question? Because it seemed like you were kind of critiquing uh, Nick's and others' views of justice. But my guess is whatever your favorite view of justice is, and whoever said it, there's going to be a lot of people that don't live up to it. Um, and the problem isn't going to be with the view, it's going to be with the people. Um, there may not be anything built into the view uh, that causes people to be unjust. It's that they don't really understand their view, or maybe they understand it and don't care. That's bothersome. But uh, I just don't see how treating people um, uh, for all their worth, according to their worth, and their worth is infinite. Um, I don't see that people not living up to that is some sort of criticism of the principle. Um, and even if founding people don't live up to it, people that propounded the idea. I still don't see that it's a criticism of the principle itself. But anyway, maybe you have a better one. But my guess is you'll have the same problem. Whatever theory you have of justice, there are going to be lots of people that don't live up
who
to
don't
it.
live up to it.
And then what? Is the theory wrong? Um, like I'm not entirely sure what I thought it's a really good question and one we have to face and one that bothers me. It really bothers me that like I'm not a Kantian, but it still bothers me that Kant so degraded women and thought they're people naturally suited to be slaves. Aristotle thought that bothers me that philosophers thought those things and thought all these good things too. Um, and I wish they hadn't, and I wish they had understood their own views better. Um, but I think we understand it better.
I think critical is to define what we mean by human. So it's what I mentioned, like what do we mean by these concepts? What do we mean by human? What do we mean by justice, by love? So I think that's critical to
Yeah.
know.
Well,
And
Nick
Kant
wrote books this thick on these things. He only gave a talk this thick, but anyway, he wrote books on these and has more to say.
but Kant has written lots of books, right? He was.
Yeah, he did too. Yeah. Yep. Good point. All right. Do you want to ask? How about we come back to you because a couple more people have questions, and I don't know how long we're going to stay. I'm not trying to avoid your questions because I like them, but um, marriage. Kane has a question, and I think uh, marriage. Are you there?
Yes.
Am I pronouncing your name right?
Yeah, it's right, Mitch.
Okay.
Okay, I also have two questions, but
Can we see you perchance
oh, of course I can.
instead of Carabelli? There we go. Carabelli. There we go.
Yeah, it's my nickname, yeah.
Okay.
The pseudonym I use. And my question, I have two questions actually, and one is actually connected with the say this question also. And apart from the how it is how these general structures are used in the words. Principally, when we think of the love and the word, the uh, yeah general nature word of the human, each human. First of all, the human word itself is something we probably would say uh, individualistic. We can give the word on our own, and we are trying to incorporate this with the love we are talking about. And love also came from the person or the society itself to criticize or uh, measure the actions of the people. So considering both the love and the word of the humans are uh, changing and volatile, how can we so easily say that?
We lost him.
Yeah,
You still?
sorry, I'm sorry.
Now you're back. We lost you for a second.
I'm sorry. In that case, how could we say that we can clearly demarcate the overall structure? I mean, even if we were to say that we are not considering of the legal phase, uh, at some point we could say that these properties at some point in one's life will change in some other point. So even in that case, it won't be preserved. So yeah, that's basically it. Wouldn't it be a problem?
Only I didn't understand all of that. Can you repeat it?
I think he's Merritt, you correct me here, okay? So I'm going to do my best. It sounds like you're saying that the terms love and justice and human are going to uh, have over history had different meanings at different times and that they could change or they will change again. Is that right?
Yeah.
And how can we say we understand it now, roughly? Is that?
Not only that, because also not as a zeitgeist, as a social level, but also individualistically, they are changing momentarily the way people see the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think then, yeah, let me start with justice. What I said is this 3rd century Roman jurist Ulpian gives a formula. Justice is justice is rendering to each person their due, their right, their use in Latin. And Justinian incorporates that and quotes that in the first paragraph of his law codex. So that definition of justice has remained. I mean, there have been other conceptions, but that's been far and away the dominant conception in the West. It hasn't really changed. Love, I observe the English word love. I don't know about the Turkish and Arabic words, counterpart words, but the English word love covers this diversity of phenomena. And in the Christian tradition, the discussion of love and justice starts from Jesus as saying, love your neighbor, and the Greek word there is agape, seeking the good of the neighbor. Human, yeah. So my view is that we've got to distinguish between humans and human persons. A human being who is in a coma cannot function as a person. They're not conscious, they cannot speak, they cannot hear, they cannot listen, and so forth. But they remain a human being. So when I say that every human being has intrinsic worth, I mean even those who cannot function as persons. So there, I've come to think it's important to keep separate persons and human beings, and even those in a coma, for example, tiny infants who cannot function yet as persons, they can't listen, they can't talk, and so forth. Nonetheless, there are ways they can still be wronged, treated unjustly. It would be wrong to take this person in a coma who's still alive and just shoot them and toss them into a dumpster. So I think the terms, I mean, we want to distinguish different senses of love, for example, but I think the terms justice, love, human being, person have remained fairly constant in the West. Of course, I'm looking at all of this as an English speaker, and whether the same thing happens in other languages. I know Dutch and French a bit and German. Don't know.
All right, I'm going to ask a question for Merit. And the question is, how would Nicholas separate just, fair punishments from punishment seeking revenge?
I have to confess that in my thinking and writing about justice, it's that first order justice that I've thought hardest about, and I haven't thought hard about second order justice. If I were younger than I am, I would do that. So how would I distinguish just punishment from revenge? Well, however we understand it, just punishment has to aim at the good of the person and society. Revenge aims at the harm of the person. It just aims to harm the person, and is justice always seeks I didn't introduce this, but justice always seeks some kind of good of the other person. And the big philosophical question is, look, if the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam gave me one of their Rembrandt paintings, that would be a great good in my life, right? Provided they also sent a police force to stand guard of this extremely valuable painting. But I don't have a right to that good. So when I think about justice, for me, one of the big questions is, how do you distinguish between those things that would be good in our lives, but to which we don't have a right, and those things that would be good in our lives to which we do have a right? But justice always seeks some kind of good, whereas revenge seeks harm. It's nature. It's not, it can't be a form of justice. By virtue of seeking harm instead of the good of the other, it's not justice. So it seems to me.
And it may be like phenomenologically indistinguishable. The person that's seeking revenge might think that they're seeking the other's good. They may not understand it, uh, but from the outside, we probably can tell lots
Yeah.
of times that it wasn't for their good. You weren't doing that for their good. Now, they may insist that they were, um, but they weren't. Um,
I suppose, but when I visit this prison and listen to the wardens talk about how they treat the prisoners, in many cases they're frankly not seeking the person's good. They're just
yeah,
getting even. You've got this coming to you.
yeah. But they might see justice as getting even. That might be their
Yeah.
bizarre sense of justice. That they've been wronged, so they're going to wrong back. That's the
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people hold that view, sadly. So
Yeah, I suppose probably quite a few people think of justice as getting even,
yeah, yeah,
evening things out.
yeah. Um, so let's see, Shahan, you have um, you want me to ask your question? Shahan Hatip, we can't really talk about love when it comes to bigger constructions like government, states, or companies, can we? And uh, they are what changes the world, not individuals. Love of individuals doesn't seem like it has a big impact on the order like of the world. Bigger foundations also have love, but for power or money, despite they're not the unideal love, they still have bigger impact than the ideal one.
Mostly I just agree with that.
Yeah,
Yeah, love is seeking the good of the other, but it's how should I put it? It's some sort of action of a human being. So institutions can seek the good of clients and other people and citizens and so forth, but it's not really. It's a cousin of love, and institutions ought likewise to seek the good of others rather than the harm.
yeah.
So
So there's
if we want to extend love to what an institution can do as opposed to a person, then there's this counterpart. Interesting point. I hadn't thought about it before. Many of you are raising points I hadn't thought about before.
Mehmet, I'm gonna let you ask the last question, and then I think we'll close this out.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. It's a great honor to have you, and also thank you for great presentation. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about the relationship between just and forgiveness? For instance, Islamic theologians usually discuss each other. For instance, Mu'tazilite, they maintain that if you don't repent in this world, in the hereafter, God is not going to forgive. Otherwise, it's going to be injustice. But usually, majority of Islamic theologians, they maintain that forgiveness doesn't cause injustice. So, but on the other hand, the Islamic theologians don't give law or we usually call, for instance, as a primary quality of God, namely, because God, uh, if you are unbeliever, God doesn't like you. We have clear verses. If you are a believer, God is going to like you or is going to love you. In Arabic word, then we can translate it as law or something like that. So it turns out secondary quality. But on the other hand, we have primary quality in terms of just, for instance, all theologians, they maintain that God is just, but on the other hand, their understanding of just is a little bit different. For instance, God can kill everyone in this world if he wants. Consider doomsday. God is going to kill everyone, right? It's not going to be injustice according to theologians, but on the other hand, if God punish someone who's innocent, it's going to turn out injustice. So, and especially, what do you think about forgiveness and just relationship? I'm just wondering. Thank you again.
Kelly, that flickered in and out here. So
Yeah, I think he basically wants you to just talk about the how you understand the relationship of forgiveness to justice. Because sometimes treating somebody according to their worth might mean punishing them. They did something,
sure.
they shouldn't have done it. It merits punishment, but you forgive them. So justice does seem to require punishment in some cases. It seems to. So how do you fit forgiveness in?
So this pertains to second order justice. I mean, forgiveness is not relevant until somebody has wronged you or wronged somebody else. Uh, and I have to, as I said before, I've thought mainly about first order justice and not second order justice. So when forgiveness is required as opposed to punishment, I don't know. I wish I did.
Forgiveness might not be required, but justice seems like it has requirements. Forgiveness seems like not exactly in the domain of requirements. Um, it might be a good. It is a good, but not a requirement. Barrett calls it a gift.
When I connect justice to requirement, it's always, I should have made this clear. It's always first order justice that I'm talking about. It seems to me that what the Christian New Testament teaches is that when we're talking about second order justice, punishment is not always required. Sometimes forgiveness is the relevant thing. So you need to speak of second order justice is a different thing from speaking of first order. I should have made that clear, Kelly, from the very beginning. That these two levels of justice, and I'm speaking mainly about the first order, the sort of bottom. And forgiveness becomes relevant when we get to that second order, and when we should forgive as opposed to punish.
Yeah.
If there's repentance, well, I don't know. I can.
Yeah, you don't have to answer that one on the spot.
Something for you to think about.
Yeah. And I think he raised it that way. It's a harder thing for Muslims to think about because there's this tension that God is always just. And there's this other thing that God says that I forgive, that I'm a forgiving God. And so I think a tension in Islam that's worth somebody here writing a really cool article and trying to work through the issues from an Islamic perspective. I think Nick's raised lots of issues that would be really great if some people went off and wrestled with them from an Islamic perspective, and then shared it with all of us. We'll come back. You have to give a talk in English. Nick and I will come back for that talk. That would be great. In the meantime, I see there are other questions, but I think I'm going to stop. We've kept Nick long enough. It's been a really terrific time, and I want to thank Nick for doing this on the 200th anniversary of
and thank
the
you all for really good
podcast.
questions.
Yeah. Nick, I think you can.
Barrett wants to ask a question, I think.
What's that?
I think we're okay, Mehmet. I think
Barrett
it's
wants to
time
ask a
to.
question.
Okay.
Oh, Mert,
Okay,
or
thank you.
all right. See you, Nick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. It's very great honor to have you.
Thank
See you,
you
Isha.
for your questions and for your attention. Thank you very much.